Under heaven's divided gaze, a generation was lost to the pride of two empires. When Persian king Khosrow II marched westward to avenge a murdered Byzantine emperor in 602, he unleashed forces neither throne could control. For 25 years, armies clashed from Jerusalem to the Caucasus, each victory more hollow than the last. Emperor Heraclius fought from the brink of annihilation to miraculous triumph, while Persia's undefeated legions crumbled from within. Neither ruler saw the desert storm rising from Arabia that would consume them both. In this twilight conflict between fire temples and crosses, two ancient powers exhausted themselves into dust. The throne of Persia trembled long before it fell. In the final years of King Hormizd IV, the court at Ctesiphon had become a nest of silks and knives. Marble floors echoed with the shuffling of eunuchs carrying secret orders. Noble families plotted in low tones while the fire temples burned ever dimmer. What had once been the most disciplined empire in Asia was now cracking along invisible seams, its armies restless, its aristocracy humiliated, its king convinced that fear was stronger than loyalty. Hormizd had inherited the Sasanian crown from his father, Khosrow I, a ruler whose justice had been spoken of in foreign tongues. Yet the son possessed none of that measured wisdom. He trusted no man who rose by merit, preferring to crush those who shone too brightly. The treasury overflowed with silver, but the army went unpaid. Generals were dismissed at the faintest rumor of ambition. In taverns from Media to Mesopotamia, soldiers began to drink to one name only, Bahram Chobin. Bahram was a general of uncommon skill, born from the ancient Mihran family, his armor said to gleam like a second sunrise on the battlefield. He had spent years fighting Turks and Huns on the empire's eastern frontier, commanding the elite Savaran cavalry. In those campaigns, he perfected a formation that made Persian horsemen the envy of the world, armored cataphracts arranged in hollow squares, each side rotating volleys of arrows before launching a thunderous charge. His victories filled the empire with pride. His growing fame filled the king with dread. When Bahram returned to court after yet another campaign, Hormizd greeted him not with gratitude, but with insult. Before the nobles and priests, the king mocked his height, his vanity, and, most unforgivable of all, his lineage. The general's reward for years of conquest was dismissal. Bahram bowed stiffly, but behind his eyes the old loyalties burned to ash. He left Ctesiphon not as a servant of the king, but as a rival blessed by fate. In the spring of 590, rebellion spread like a desert fire. Bahram's veterans, hardened in the east, rallied to his banner. The aristocrats who had chafed under Hormizd's tyranny threw open their coffers. The empire's fortresses, starved of faith in their sovereign, began to shift allegiance. Hormizd responded with cruelty, executing nobles, blinding officers, even accusing his own sons of conspiracy. But fear could no longer keep the walls intact. Among those sons was Prince Khosrow, the second of Hormizd's line, a young man of learning and quick temper, educated in the philosophies of both Persia and Greece. Unlike his father, Khosrow valued diplomacy and saw that his dynasty's survival depended on more than terror. When the palace guards finally turned on Hormizd, it was Khosrow who hesitated. The king was dragged from his throne and blinded. Within days, he was dead, strangled by his own nobles. Ctesiphon rejoiced, yet the rejoicing had no center, for Bahram was already marching west. The general declared himself the restorer of Persian honor. He claimed the gods had abandoned the house of Sasan for its decadence, and that he, born of warrior blood, was chosen to cleanse it. His army, disciplined and fanatically loyal, advanced in squares that shimmered across the plains like moving mirrors. By summer, the banners of Bahram had reached the Tigris. Khosrow, proclaimed king, in name but ruling no land, fled the capital under cover of darkness with a handful of retainers. Behind him, the empire he had barely inherited was breaking apart. For weeks they rode north through burnt fields and ghost villages. Refugees lined the roads, farmers whose harvests had been seized by rival garrisons, priests carrying the sacred flame in bronze urns, widows who whispered prayers to any god that still listened. When Khosrow's small caravan reached the border of Roman Armenia, Exhaustion had stripped away royal ceremony. He was a fugitive king without a crown, his horse gaunt, his cloak caked with dust. Beyond the mountains lay the empire of another weary ruler, Emperor Maurice of Byzantium. The two states had been enemies for generations, their wars stretching from the Euphrates to the deserts of Arabia. Yet necessity makes strange kinships. Maurice, practical and cautious, saw in the Persian prince not a rival, but a leaver, a man who could return Persia to its throne under Rome's favor. For Khosrow, the alliance was humiliation laced with hope. He crossed the frontier unarmed and was received not as a monarch, but as a supplicant beneath Byzantine standards. At the fortress of Hierapolis, the two met face to face. Chroniclers wrote that Khosrow knelt and placed his crown, a battered circlet carried from Ctesiphon, at the emperor's feet. Maurice lifted it, studied the bent metal, and smiled. Their pact was sealed with iron rather than ink. In exchange for military aid, the Persians would cede several contested provinces and swear peace for a generation. For both men, it was a wager on survival. When the joint army marched east in the winter of 590, it was a sight unseen for centuries. Byzantine legions marching beside Persian cataphracts, the eagles and the crescent lions sharing one wind. Bahram's forces met them near Ganzak in Azerbaijan. The battle raged across frozen ground. Horsemen crashed against shield walls. Arrows hissed in snowlight. Bahram's cavalry squares held firm until a Roman detachment feigned retreat, drawing them out of position. Then Khosrow's own troops struck the exposed flanks. The square collapsed inward, its discipline unraveling into panic. When the sun set, the field was littered with the bodies of men who had once marched together against Turks and Huns. Bahram's banner, a black stallion embroidered in gold, lay trampled in the mud. He fled toward the east, vanishing among the tribes of Central Asia, where rumor claimed he was later slain by his own hosts. Khosrow entered Ctesiphon at the head of his Byzantine allies, the city gates swinging open as though by divine decree. The nobles lined the avenue, proclaiming their loyalty once more, but their eyes measured him with the same careful calculation that had doomed his father. On the steps of the White Palace, Khosrow gave thanks to the god of fire and to the Christian emperor who had restored him. Yet even as he poured the ritual oil into the sacred flame, smoke from the battlefield still clung to his armor. Peace had returned, but it was not the peace of triumph. It was the stillness of exhaustion. The king had reclaimed his throne by foreign swords and foreign oaths. Behind the jeweled masks of ceremony, many wondered whether the house of Sasan had been saved or merely postponed its doom. For in the embers of Bahram's rebellion, a darker flame was already stirring, the fire of vengeance that would one day consume two empires. Ctesiphon glittered once more, though beneath its shine, the air carried the scent of old smoke. After years of rebellion and exile, King Khosrow II sat again on the peacock throne, his crown set with turquoise and lapis, the flame of victory trembling above the altars. The courtiers called him Aparvez, the victorious. Yet the victory had come through another emperor's mercy. The men who bowed before him knew this and waited to see whether gratitude or pride would guide the new reign. In those first years, Khosrow governed like a man performing surgery on a wounded body. The empire had bled from a dozen cuts. Rebel garrisons in Media, ruined canals in Mesopotamia, taxes uncollected in the north. He restored the imperial bureaucracy with the precision of an accountant and the confidence of a man who had wandered long in exile. Gold flowed again through the treasury. Granaries were reopened, and the army, unpaid since Hormizd's paranoia, was granted arrears and new uniforms. To secure loyalty, he rewarded those who had followed him through hardship. Rustam, son of Farrukh Hormizd, received command of the western provinces. Shahbaraz, a soldier who had risen from obscurity, was given the king's trust and an army to match it. Khosrow knew that empire could be governed only by men who owed him everything and feared him equally. His gratitude toward Byzantium, though genuine at first, began to sour with prosperity. Emperor Maurice had kept his promise, returning the lost fortresses along the border, yet his envoys never let Khosrow forget the debt owed. To the Romans, he was a client. To the Persians, he was a king, restored by foreign hands. Every gesture of friendship now carried a shadow of humiliation. Still, the years following his return were the most splendid of his dynasty. The White Palace was rebuilt with marble quarried from Fars and pillars imported from Antioch. Musicians filled its courtyards with songs of the god Ahura Mazda's favor. The court chroniclers wrote that the empire stretched from the Arabian desert to the Oxus, from the mountains of Armenia to the gates of India. Caravans carried silk and spice through safe roads. Zoroastrian fire temples gleamed in every major city. Khosrow's court became a theater of abundance. Guests entered through halls lined with mosaic panels depicting his triumph over Bahram. Their ceilings were painted with stars to mirror the heavens. The king himself presided in a robe sewn with gold thread, his boots set with emeralds from Ceylon. Foreign envoys left Ctesiphon dazzled and uneasy, whispering that the Persians had resurrected the glory of Darius and Cyrus. But behind the spectacle lay a deeper ambition, to make the empire unassailable through divine order. Khosrow saw his rule as a mirror of the cosmos, every rank fixed, every subject orbiting the throne. He expanded the power of the Magi, the Zoroastrian priesthood, giving them a voice in civil law and property disputes. Fire temples multiplied, their towers of flame visible for miles at night. The king's proclamations spoke of purity, obedience, and cosmic harmony, yet his laws grew heavy with punishment. Apostasy, heresy, and corruption of ritual fire were crimes now met with confiscation or death. Merchants prospered under this celestial order. The imperial mint issued new drachms, stamped with Khosrow's serene profile. At first, each coin gleamed with nearly pure silver, but as campaigns multiplied and the royal treasury strained, the content began to fade, from 9 parts to 5. Traders noticed the coins growing pale, and in bazaars across Persia, whispers began, "Even the king's image loses its shine." By 600, the empire had reached its widest extent since the days of the Achaemenids. Roads were guarded by cavalry patrols, fortresses garrisoned with veteran Savaran horsemen, their armor polished to mirror brightness. These men drilled relentlessly in the fields outside Ctesiphon, cataphracts forming perfect squares, advancing in rhythm as musicians beat kettle drums to signal maneuvers. Khosrow loved to watch them from a raised pavilion, remarking that order was the highest form of beauty. He was also a man of letters, fluent in Greek, Syriac, and Persian. Scholars found favor at his court, and poets composed verses comparing him to Solomon. Philosophers from conquered Antioch and Edessa were invited to debate theology with the Magi. Even Nestorian Christian clerics found cautious tolerance under his reign. Khosrow was fascinated by their mysteries, though he insisted that salvation belonged only to those who served the sacred flame. For a decade, peace endured between Persia and Byzantium. Two great empires, bound by exhausted friendship, regarded each other across the Euphrates like wary brothers who had once shared a wound. Maurice wrote to Khosrow with paternal advice, calling him "my son in fortune." The Persian king answered with gifts, silks, perfumes, a white elephant from India, but each letter carried beneath its courtesy a trace of resentment. In those tranquil years, Khosrow married Shirin, a Christian noblewoman famed for her beauty and intellect. Chroniclers describe her as the only person who could temper the king's will. Their union became legend in both Persian and Roman tongues, a romance sung by poets long after the empire itself had turned to dust. Shirin's counsel was often gentle but firm. She urged restraint in war, fairness in taxation, and compassion toward conquered peoples. Khosrow listened, but ambition murmured louder. By 602, the peace that had steadied the region began to strain. Reports reached Ctesiphon of unrest in the Balkans. Maurice, burdened by mutinous troops, demanded his army winter beyond the Danube to save money. The soldiers rebelled, proclaiming a centurion named Phocas as emperor. Within weeks, the old ally who had restored Khosrow's crown was dead, executed with his sons, their bodies cast into the sea. The news reached Persia like a divine summons. Khosrow, who had once fled his homeland with nothing but a broken crown, now saw the heavens reverse the fates. He called his generals, Shahbaraz and Shahin chief among them, and declared that Maurice's murder would not go unavenged. Whether justice or vengeance moved him is known only to the gods, but his proclamation resounded through the empire. The Romans had slain a rightful emperor and broken the order of the world. Preparations began immediately. Armories clanged through the nights. War horses were bred and armored anew. Across the Euphrates, fortresses stirred like waking beasts. Scribes recorded inventories: 10,000 spears, 6,000 cuirasses, 20 catapults. Priests lit consecrated flames before every campaign, praying that the king's justice would cleanse the earth. Still, those closest to Khosrow sensed that this war was different. No treaty demanded it, no border dispute required it. It was an act of faith and pride intertwined. The empire was strong, its coffers heavy, its soldiers disciplined, but peace had made them restless. In the final months before the invasion, the king walked often through the gardens of his palace, where fountains murmured beside imported cypresses. Witnesses say he would stop before the statue of Bahram Chobin, once his rival, now cast in bronze, and placed deliberately beneath the feet of a lion. "He rose against me," Khosrow once told a courtier, "and the gods gave me victory. Now I will rise against the world itself." The fire temples blazed brighter than ever, consuming mountains of cedar and myrrh. Priests proclaimed omens of divine favor. The planets aligned, eagles nesting over battle standards, flames that burned blue through the night. When Khosrow mounted his horse and took up the imperial standard, the golden spear crowned with a crescent, he did not look back toward the palace. What he set in motion that day would endure beyond his life, devouring both empires in flame. But for now, the king rode eastward beneath banners of crimson and gold, his armor gleaming, his heart certain that heaven itself would bear his cause. Winter settled over the Danube frontier like a curse. Emperor Maurice had ordered his legions to stay north of the river for the season, a cost-saving decree that seemed to mock the exhaustion of men who had bled for him. The soldiers, ragged and frostbitten, listened to the wind scrape across their tents and swore that even the emperor's heart must be made of ice. Among them rose the voice of Phocas, a coarse centurion with a scarred face and the dangerous gift of simplicity. He spoke what they all felt, that the emperor cared more for gold than for the men who earned it. When dawn broke, the army no longer marched under imperial standards, but beneath Phocas's makeshift banner. They crossed into Thrace, gathering momentum like an avalanche. Constantinople, tired of Maurice's austerity, opened its gates. Within days, the emperor who had once restored Khosrow II's throne was dragged from sanctuary and executed along with his sons. Their severed heads were displayed before the mob, and the new ruler declared himself the defender of Rome. Far away in Ctesiphon, the news reached the Persian court, wrapped in silk and disbelief. Khosrow listened without a word, the messenger trembling as he spoke the details. Maurice slain, the royal children drowned, the throne usurped by a common soldier. For a long while, the king said nothing. Then, quietly, he gave an order that would ignite the last and most ruinous of the ancient wars. The banners of Persia would arise again. Officially, Khosrow called it vengeance. He claimed the gods demanded justice for the murdered emperor who had once saved his life. Yet those who knew him saw another fire behind his eyes, a hunger to erase the memory of dependence. Avenging Maurice would also avenge Khosrow's own humiliation. Mobilization began with precision. The Savaran cavalry gathered from every province, their armor polished until the desert sun flashed across 1,000 mirrored plates. Supply trains rolled westward, laden with grain, dried fruit, and silver coinage. Debased, but still bearing the king's calm profile. Priests lit consecrated flames along the Euphrates, blessing each spear that would cross into Roman land. Khosrow appointed his most trusted commanders, Shahrbaraz, the leopard of the south, and Shahin, a strategist famed for patience rather than glory. Each was given full autonomy, a gesture that revealed both confidence and calculation. Shahrbaraz would lead the main offensive into Mesopotamia, while Shahin advanced north through Armenia, cutting off Roman reinforcements from the Caucasus. In early 603, the Sasanian war machine began to move. Cataphracts advanced in deep squares, their formation nearly impervious to frontal attack. The first blows fell on Dara, the Roman fortress that had once guarded the empire's eastern gate. Byzantine garrisons, leaderless and demoralized by Phocas's erratic commands, surrendered after brief resistance. Those who held fast were broken by Persian siegecraft, towers of cedar and iron, pushed forward under covering volleys of flaming arrows. Within weeks, the walls that had defied Persia for generations were breached. Shahrbaraz pressed westward with calculated brutality. His troops sacked Edessa, cutting down defenders in the narrow streets while engineers extinguished the Christian lamps that burned above the city gates. In captured fortresses, the Persians left garrisons of mixed origin: Persian officers, Armenian auxiliaries, Arab mercenaries, so that loyalty was divided and rebellion impossible. To the terrified populations, Khosrow's proclamations arrived nailed to the walls. This is not conquest, but restoration. The false emperor Phocas shall be purged by fire. In Constantinople, Phocas's rule degenerated into a spectacle of fear. He executed officials suspected of sympathy for Maurice's memory, replacing them with flatterers and kin. The imperial treasury drained into the hands of bribe-seekers. When news arrived of Dara's fall, he ordered public prayers instead of reinforcements. The Senate whispered of divine punishment, and the patriarch muttered that God had turned his face from the city. Through 603 and 604, the Persian tide rolled on. Shahin's northern columns captured Theodosiopolis. Shah-Baraz's main army crossed the Euphrates unopposed. Villages surrendered without a fight. Others burned to black husks in the wake of the advance. Captured soldiers were offered a single mercy: swear loyalty to the King of Kings, or join their comrades in the ditch. The efficiency of Persia's campaign stunned the world. Khosrow's intelligence network, rebuilt since his exile, fed him reports from every front. Each victory was celebrated with sacrifices at the fire temples. Each captured city sent a procession of prisoners to Ctesiphon, paraded through the capital before being marched into servitude. For the first time in living memory, the Roman provinces east of the Euphrates lay open. In the west, Phocas's generals tried to assemble a defense, but without pay or confidence, the Byzantine legions dissolved into scattered militias. One chronicler described them as men who fought like ghosts for a ghost of an empire. When Edessa finally fell, its defenders were crucified along the road as a warning to others. Even the Persians grew weary of the slaughter. The captives were too many, the graves too shallow. Within 2 years, Khosrow's armies had overrun Mesopotamia and parts of Syria. Antioch trembled, its walls manned by priests and merchants rather than soldiers. The King of Kings sent a letter to Phocas demanding his abdication, addressed mockingly to the murderer who calls himself emperor. Phocas's reply was silence. His messengers were too afraid to deliver the parchment. The momentum of victory began to reshape Persia itself. The empire's treasuries swelled with spoils. Gold plate, manuscripts, relics from Christian churches melted for coin. In the bazaars of Ctesiphon, merchants sold Roman silks by the yard, and nobles adorned their halls with statues taken from Antioch's sanctuaries. The people spoke of Khosrow as a living god, and the priests agreed. The king's image was added to temple carvings beside that of Ahura Mazda, his profile half human, half divine. But each triumph brought a subtle corrosion. Soldiers returning from the west carried luxuries they could not have imagined before: dyed fabrics, jeweled chalices, slaves who spoke Greek prayers. Discipline weakened. Commanders quarreled over spoils, and the cost of feeding new garrisons drained provincial coffers. Though victory had made Persia rich, its coinage grew ever lighter, its silver now little more than a shine over copper. By late 604, Phocas's empire was unraveling. The Persians stood within reach of Antioch, and the Roman populace no longer believed deliverance possible. When the city finally fell, its churches were looted and its defenders slaughtered. The captives were driven eastward in chains, forming a column that stretched for miles. In Ctesiphon, Khosrow received the news with measured satisfaction, yet even in his triumph, he remained haunted by a single name: Maurice. The vengeance he had sworn was fulfilled, but the man he had avenged was still dead, the friendship forever unbalanced. Some said that he ordered a feast that night, where the first toast was made to the murdered emperor. Others claimed he dined alone, staring into the flame as though it might speak. The war that had begun as retribution had already become something else, an intoxication of conquest. Persia's armies, drunk on victory, pressed deeper into Byzantine lands. Behind them, the empire they left began to hollow, its resources pouring westward, its strength scattered across mountains and deserts. What had started as an act of justice was turning into a hunger without end, and in that hunger lay the ruin of both crowns. The Euphrates had ceased to be a frontier. By the time the spring of 604 bled into summer, Persian horsemen were watering their mounts in its western tributaries, and the watchtowers that once guarded the Roman border had become Persian granaries. The sky above Mesopotamia darkened with banners stitched in gold thread, lions, suns, crescents, and the sound of hooves replaced the tolling of church bells. Shahrbaraz led the invasion with the precision of a blacksmith shaping hot iron. His Savaran cavalry advanced in iron-clad squares, each flank bristling with archers who loosed their arrows in rhythmic volleys before the charge. Behind them moved camel trains carrying siege engines, catapults, towers, and rams dismantled into hundreds of wooden ribs. The Persian army had learned the Roman art of logistics and then surpassed it. They travelled with their own forgers and carpenters, their own priests and scribes, an empire on the march. The first blows fell upon Dara, the fortress that Emperor Justinian had once called the Eastern Shield of Christendom. It held out for weeks, its walls battered by engines that hurled stone the weight of oxen. At last, fire and exhaustion did what steel could not. Persian engineers tunneled beneath the southern gate, collapsing an entire section of wall. The garrison was cut down, and Shahrbaraz ordered the survivors deported eastward. Some 20,000 souls, it was said, were marched across the plains toward Ctesiphon to labor for the king's glory. Next came Edessa. The city resisted longer, believing its relics and saints would guard it. But by 609, the citizens had begun to starve. Shahrbaraz constructed towering siege machines that crept forward under a rain of flaming pitch. When the gates finally opened, the Persians poured through in silence, disciplined even in victory. Churches were stripped of their silver. The population, spared massacre, was bound for slavery. By then, Constantinople was no longer governed. It was merely enduring. Phocas's tyranny had drained the treasury, and the army fought without pay or morale. Provincial governors acted as small kings, fortifying their own cities and ignoring the capital's decrees. Each new defeat bred another rebellion. The empire of Justinian, once dazzling and defiant, was now a candle guttering in its own wax. In 610, as Persian standards advanced toward the Levant, another army rose from Africa. Heraclius, son of the Exarch of Carthage, sailed with a fleet of rebels toward the Bosporus, while Shahrbaraz stormed fortress after fortress in the east. Heraclius entered Constantinople to the roar of a desperate populace. Phocas, dragged from his palace, met the blade with a final snarl. The crowd welcomed Heraclius as savior, but he inherited little more than a broken empire. The Persians did not pause for the change of rulers. To Khosrow II, it made no difference which Roman wore the diadem. The war, once avowed as vengeance, had become holy and imperial. He named Shahrbaraz supreme commander of the West and ordered him to cleanse Syria and Palestine of Roman power. Shahin, his northern counterpart, would keep pressure on Anatolia, feinting toward Cappadocia to divide Byzantine defenses. Between 610 and 613, the storm rolled southward. The Persian advance was a study in method: capture a fortress, deport the populace, fortify the walls anew, and use the city as a forward base. Garrisons of mixed heritage, Persians, Armenians, Arabs from Hira, ensured no single faction could rebel. Shahrbaraz's proclamations promised justice to all who surrendered and annihilation to those who resisted. Entire regions bent the knee without a fight, preferring captivity to slaughter. When Antioch fell in 613, the slaughter was biblical. The city that had once rivaled Alexandria in wealth was taken street by street, its walls breached by siege towers draped in wet hides to resist flame. Chroniclers speak of 40,000 dead, though numbers are a pale echo of the truth. The Orontes ran red for days. Its bridges sagged under the weight of corpses. Survivors were marched eastward through Aleppo's dust, their shadows long and silent. In Constantinople, word of the catastrophe reached Heraclius amid famine and riots. He walked through the Hagia Sophia barefoot, leading processions of penitents. The patriarch Sergius carried relics of the saints through the streets, begging divine mercy. Yet even prayers could not fill the granaries. Egypt's grain convoys had been cut off by Persian raids. The capital starved while its armies disintegrated. Shahrbaraz pressed his advantage, sweeping down the Syrian coast. Tyre and Sidon surrendered. Gaza burned. The Persians had learned from their Greek enemies the power of the sea, but rather than build fleets, they built roads, ensuring that their armies could strike any coastal city before the Byzantines could reinforce it by ship. Discipline and ruthlessness moved together. Every conquered town fed the next assault. As the Persians neared Jerusalem, Christian chroniclers described omens: blood rain, eclipses, statues that wept. To the Persians, these were signs of divine favor. They surrounded the holy city in the spring of 614, their siege engines forming a ring of iron around the walls. The defenders fought with fanatic faith, knowing what awaited them if they failed. For 21 days, stones thundered against ramparts. Towers burned, rebuilt, and burned again. Finally, a breach opened near the Damascus Gate. The storming of Jerusalem was swift and merciless. Persians, allied Arab contingents, and disaffected Jews poured through the city. Churches were desecrated. The great basilica of the Holy Sepulchre was set aflame. The relic of the true cross, the most sacred symbol in Christendom, was seized and sent east as a trophy for Khosrow. Nearly 90,000 were said to have perished or been enslaved. When the news reached Constantinople, a collective wail swept through the city. It was not merely a loss of land, but a wound to the soul. The Byzantines believed that heaven itself had turned its face away. Some blamed the sins of the people, others the incompetence of emperors. Heraclius, though newly crowned, bore the weight of both. Meanwhile, in Ctesiphon, celebration drowned conscience. Khosrow presided over ceremonies that lasted for days. The relic of the true cross was displayed in the White Palace beside the sacred fire. Courtiers claimed the flame rose higher than ever, as though acknowledging its equal. Priests chanted hymns likening the king to divine light itself. Yet behind the rituals, cracks widened. Endless war required endless coin. The silver content of Persia's drachms fell again. Governors delayed remitting taxes. Generals began to act as lords of their own fiefs. Still, to the world beyond Persia, Khosrow's empire appeared invincible. His banners now flew over Damascus, Jerusalem, and Antioch. His name was invoked in Armenia, his decrees obeyed in Egypt's frontier garrisons. The Romans, their cities smouldering, seemed to have no breath left to resist. And yet within the ruins of Byzantium, a new discipline was forming. Heraclius, the young emperor, studied the failures of his predecessors with a soldier's clarity. He saw that defense had only fed defeat. From the ashes of Antioch and Jerusalem, he began to imagine a war fought not from walls, but from faith and movement. For now, though, the world belonged to Persia. The fire temples blazed so bright that sailors claimed they could see their glow from the eastern Mediterranean. Khosrow, the second, master of half the known world, believed that Ahura Mazda had fulfilled his covenant with the house of Sasan. He did not know that the flame, when it burned too high, consumed its own altar. When the fleet of Heraclius approached the Golden Horn, the sea lay still, as if waiting to judge him. Smoke drifted above the city walls. Wood smoke from starving households, tar from the docks, incense from the churches that prayed for deliverance. Constantinople shimmered like a relic too sacred to touch and too damaged to restore. The new emperor's ships entered a harbour, lined with hollow-eyed citizens who watched without cheering. They had seen too many saviors arrive in triumph and depart in disgrace. The corpse of Phocas still hung from the gate tower, blackened by sun and wind. His fall had ended one tyranny, but not the decay that bred it. In the streets, dogs gnawed at refuse where fountains once ran. The markets were nearly empty. Merchants offered wilted herbs, stale bread, or trinkets stripped from the dead. For 10 years the empire had been bleeding from its edges, and the arteries led straight to this city of marble and ash. Heraclius came not as conqueror, but as physician summoned to a dying patient. He found the treasury hollow and the army scattered. The Balkans had vanished beneath Slavic settlements. The Danube frontier lay open to Avar raids, and to the east, the Persian king ruled from Antioch to the Nile. Egypt, the empire's stomach, was cut away. Its grain fleets captured or burned. The emperor read the ledgers himself. Where once 8 million artabai of wheat had filled the granaries each year, now there were none. His council urged him to abandon the capital. "Sail to Carthage," they said. "There we may build anew." The suggestion hung in the chamber like smoke. Heraclius looked at the bronze map inlaid upon the floor, tracing the rivers and borders that had defined Rome for centuries. "If I leave this city," he said, "I leave the world." He began by stripping the empire to its bones. Taxes were postponed, debts forgiven, church treasure requisitioned. Gold chalices, reliquaries, and icons were melted into coin. 200,000 pounds of metal passed through the mint. Faith transmuted into survival. The patriarch Sergius declared that such sacrifice was holy. The citizens muttered that even God was being pawned. The emperor reorganized what remained of the army. Veterans were settled on frontier lands, their pay drawn from the soil they tilled. It was less reform than triage, but it gave the empire a pulse. The fleet, though half-rotted, was repaired. Garrisons were merged into mobile units commanded by men Heraclius trusted to obey, not flatter. Each decree was a gamble made with the last coins of authority. Beyond these efforts, disaster marched unhindered. In 611, Persian columns stormed Cappadocia. By the next year, Damascus had fallen. In 613, Antioch, Rome's eastern citadel, was lost after a single day's fighting. Heraclius himself had led that army, riding at the center of a line too thin to hold. When the rout began, he fought through the dust until his horse collapsed beneath him. His guards dragged him away, half-conscious, to the coast. The emperor who had sworn to save the empire returned home with nothing but a scarred sword and a silence that frightened his own ministers. Famine followed defeat. Without Egyptian grain, Constantinople starved. Bread was rationed by weight. Corpses were buried in shallow trenches along the harbour. The air stank of rot and salt. Rumour whispered that Heraclius would flee after all, that he had ordered ships prepared for Carthage under cover of night. When Patriarch Sergius learned of it, he confronted the emperor in the Hagia Sophia. "Swear before God," the patriarch demanded, "that you will not leave the city to its grave." Heraclius stood before the altar, the mosaics flickering with candlelight, and swore. From that moment, every resource, earthly or divine, belonged to war. The oath-bound emperor and city like chain and anchor. In Persia, celebration answered despair. Khosrow II sat upon the peacock throne, while dancers scattered rose petals at his feet. The relic of the true cross, seized from Jerusalem, was displayed beside the sacred fire. Courtiers knelt, claiming that the two flames, the divine and the royal, burned as one. Yet the victory hid corrosion. To pay for endless campaigns, Khosrow reduced the silver in his drachms from 90 to 50%. Merchants weighed coins against older ones and found them wanting. Even triumph had begun to sound hollow. In 613, as Constantinople endured hunger, Shahrbaraz's legions advanced through the Levant unopposed. Their discipline was mathematical. Each fortress surrounded, each city reduced, its population deported east to repopulate Persian provinces. By spring 614, Jerusalem itself was encircled. The defenders fought behind walls scorched black from earlier sieges. Priests carried relics along the battlements, while arrows hissed through the smoke. For 21 days, the siege engines roared. On the 22nd, a section of wall collapsed near the Damascus gate, and the city was consumed. Eyewitnesses later claimed that the Orontes ran red, that churches burned for a week, that the Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre fell with its roof aflame. 90,000 died or were enslaved. When the Persians carried the true cross eastward, even their captains wondered if they had gone too far. The messenger who brought news of the disaster reached Constantinople half dead from exhaustion. He staggered into the great church during Vespers, shouting the tidings before collapsing at the patriarch's feet. The congregation answered with a single moan that rose into weeping. Bells tolled through the night. Women tore their veils. Men beat their breasts in the streets. The loss was not strategic. It was cosmic. Heraclius listened in silence, then dismissed his court and walked alone along the sea walls. Beyond the strait, Persian campfires glimmered near Chalcedon. The enemy was close enough to see, yet the emperor felt further from victory than any man alive. The empire he ruled now consisted of walls, water, and faith. He turned to study the sea. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay the eastern deserts where Khosrow's empire shone like a mirage. The thought struck him with the clarity of revelation. If Persia's armies could cross continents to destroy, then Rome's could cross deserts to redeem. The Strategicon of Maurice lay open on his desk that night, its margins filled with the emperor's new handwriting. Sketches of routes, supply lists, alliances to be forged among the Khazars and Armenians. He began to imagine a war of movement, fought not for territory, but for survival's sake. That vision would take years to bloom, but the seed was sown amid ruin. For now, Heraclius became the city's embodiment of endurance. He trained daily with the soldiers, his armor plain, his beard untrimmed. The people saw him drilling in the fields beyond the Blakeney quarter, lifting shield and spear until his arms bled. "You are the last Romans," he told them, "and I am the first among the condemned." Each dawn, the church bells echoed those words across the harbour, mingling with the clang of hammers repairing the fleet. Constantinople, though starving, began to move again. Hope returned not as joy, but as rhythm, the rhythm of oars on the water, of soldiers marching to the gatehouses, of priests chanting through sleepless nights. Khosrow, hearing of the emperor's renewed preparations, dismissed them with laughter. "Let the ghost rattle its chains," he said. Yet his laughter did not travel far. Reports arrived of mutinies among garrisons, of empty granaries, of governors enriching themselves beyond restraint. Victory had stretched the empire thin as hammered gold. By the winter of 614, the two rulers faced one another across the narrow Bosporus, Heraclius behind the triple walls of Constantinople, Shahrbaraz encamped on the Asian shore, his fires mirrored in the sea. Between them lay a silence that seemed to hold the world's breath. Heraclius climbed the palace terrace and gazed east. The wind smelled of ash and salt. The moon glinted on the water like a blade. "The empire dies each time we wait," he murmured. Somewhere below, the bells began to ring again, slow, deliberate, defiant. He turned from the sea and called for his generals. Soon, he told them, they would march not to defend, but to redeem. Across ages, the desert had stood as a threshold between empires. For centuries, it divided the Roman world from the Persian. Yet by 616 AD, the boundary existed only on old maps and fading coins. Shahrbaraz, the king's most relentless commander, now led his army along the coastal road toward Egypt, the last unbroken artery of Byzantine power. The Nile was the empire's breath, its yearly flood the rhythm of its survival. Whoever possessed it would hold Constantinople by the throat. The campaign began with precision rather than spectacle. Shahrbaraz knew that conquest was sustained not by victories, but by supply. His engineers repaired the roads first. His scouts secured water sources along the way. Each unit moved with its own train of camels and oxen, every load measured and recorded by scribes who rode at the center of the column. Behind them followed priests bearing portable fire altars. When they halted at dusk, the camp filled with the scent of cedar and oil, the flames burning in shallow bronze dishes like small suns. Egypt, under the Byzantine governor Nicetas, was prosperous but far from prepared. Years of imperial neglect had left the fortresses undermanned, their walls eroded by Nile floods. Local officials, loyal only to their own survival, bartered information for promises of safety. Persian gold traveled faster than Persian swords. When the first skirmishes erupted near Pelusium, whole garrisons changed banners overnight. Shahrbaraz advanced as if unrolling a scroll, each fortress a line, each victory a syllable. His cataphracts moved through the delta in tight formation, squares of armored riders whose discipline resembled ceremony more than war. Their arrows fell in arcs that blotted out the sun. Their charges shattered the improvised Byzantine levies. Every captured city was forced to feed the next, each grain store sealed and marked with the royal stamp. Alexandria alone refused submission. For 14 months it held, surrounded by marshes and siege lines that cut the city off from sea and land alike. Within its walls, the great library's halls became barracks. Churches served as armories. Citizens melted household silver to fund the defense. Famine crept from house to house. The governor's proclamations promised relief from Constantinople, but no sails appeared on the horizon. When the Persians finally breached the sea wall in the spring of 619, the defenders had neither food nor strength left. Shahrbaraz entered the city in silence. No massacre followed. The victory itself was punishment enough. He inspected the granaries, once the empire's treasure vault, and ordered the harvests diverted east. 8 million artabai of grain, the measure that had fed the capital each year, would now fill Persian storehouses. What sustained Rome would nourish its enemy. Khosrow received the news in Ctesiphon with something close to wonder. He had become master of the richest provinces of the known world. From the Indus to the Nile, his decrees travelled by courier and caravan, sealed with the sign of the winged fire. Courtiers claimed that even the gods envied his reach. The White Palace overflowed with trophies: ivory from Africa, gold plate from Antioch, papyrus scrolls from Alexandria, written in languages few Persians could read. Yet triumph brought no rest. The weight of empire pressed heavily upon its bearer. Each new conquest demanded more coin, more garrisons, more faith. The silver coinage, once bright and solid, dulled with copper until merchants in the bazaars weighed it suspiciously. The cost of keeping the army in Egypt alone, tens of thousands of men, horses, and engineers, strained the treasury. Khosrow ordered the mint to increase production, flooding the realm with new drachms that shone briefly before tarnishing in the hands of his subjects. Even the Magi murmured of imbalance. The sacred flame, they warned, must be tended, not forced to devour endlessly. Khosrow ignored them. He believed himself the chosen of Ahura Mazda, guardian of order in a world ruled by corruption. The priests fell silent, but the whispers spread through the capital that the King of Kings had begun to hear only his own voice. In Constantinople, Heraclius learned of Egypt's fall as a condemned man learns the hour of his death. Messengers arrived thin as shadows, their ships nearly wrecked by storms. They brought word that Alexandria's gates had opened, that the granaries were lost, that the Persians now held the delta entire. The emperor received the report without speaking. His advisors waited for orders that never came. He dismissed them and retreated to his chamber, where the map of the empire, once a continent of red ink, had become a scattering of isolated coasts. For days he neither ate nor slept. The courtiers whispered that he had gone mad, that he wandered the halls reciting psalms in Greek and Syriac. In truth, he was listening to silence, to the thin voice within that refused surrender. Out of that stillness came decision. If the empire's body was gone, its spirit must become a blade. He began to prepare not for defense, but for pilgrimage. Egypt's loss marked the zenith of Persia's expansion. From the perspective of the White Palace, the world seemed divided into those who obeyed and those who awaited conquest. Yet distance breeds delusion. In the provinces, governors hoarded taxes. Soldiers on the western frontier muttered over pay delayed for months. Mercenaries sold their loyalty twice in a season. The great machine that had carried the Sasanian banners to the sea began to grind under its own weight. Shahrbaraz, ever practical, saw it first. He wrote to the king, warning that supply lines stretched across hostile deserts and seas, that garrisons in Syria and Egypt already cost more than they yielded. Khosrow answered with rebuke. "You are my arm," he wrote, "not my counselor. Strike until the enemy is no more." Shahrbaraz obeyed, but the letter's echo lingered. In conquered Alexandria, the Persian general governed with austere efficiency. He taxed the Coptic farmers lightly to secure their labor and allowed the Christian clergy to preach under supervision. His rule was pragmatic, almost merciful, for he understood that empire endured longer through grain than through terror. Barges laden with wheat drifted down the Nile. Their sails dyed crimson with the king's emblem. The harvest of Egypt now flowed eastward toward Ctesiphon, a river of sustenance and temptation. The war that had begun as vengeance now fed itself on momentum. Heraclius's empire seemed extinguished, Persia's unchallenged. Yet even in victory, unease rippled through the royal court. The Magi warned that expansion without rest was defiance of the cosmic order. Generals feared overextension. Merchants complained that trade with the West had vanished. The King of Kings, hearing these laments, dismissed them all as cowardice. "Let them call me fire," he said. "I was not born to be ash." In the deserts beyond Egypt's frontier, his legions built altars from brick and bone, the flames flickering under stars. They believed themselves eternal, guardians of the new world their king had forged. But among the embers of conquered lands, Another fire smoldered, small, unseen, and patient. Heraclius, in the quiet halls of his battered capital, had begun to breathe again. He was already planning the unthinkable, to strike back across mountains and seas, to wound the empire that believed itself immortal. The empire that had almost perished began to stir. By the spring of 622 AD, Constantinople no longer wept. It waited. After a decade of humiliation, famine, and prayer, Heraclius decided that survival itself was not enough. The Persian banners flew from Jerusalem to Alexandria, their cavalry patrolling the deserts where Roman legions had once marched. The emperor had watched the flame of his faith carried into captivity, and now he meant to bring it home. Rebuilding had begun in secret years earlier. While Persia's armies stretched across 3 continents, Heraclius had turned Constantinople into a fortress of iron and resolve. The patriarch Sergius became his minister as much as his priest, commanding workshops where bells, chalices, and even the church's bronze doors were melted into weapons. Families donated heirlooms to the foundries. Widows gave their wedding rings for the fleet. The empire's last gold shimmered not in treasuries, but in sword hilts and spearheads. The army that emerged from this crucible was smaller than any the Romans had fielded in centuries, but it was alive with faith. Soldiers drilled outside the city walls, their shields freshly painted with crosses rather than eagles. They were paid not with gold, but with land, their loyalty measured in prayers whispered before dawn. Heraclius trained beside them, a lean figure hardened by years of hunger. Chroniclers wrote that his gaze seemed lit from within, as though the emperor carried a private flame none could extinguish. When the campaign began in early spring, even the weather seemed uncertain. The emperor's ship crossed the Bosporus beneath low clouds, the sea churning with mist. As he stepped onto the Asiatic shore, Heraclius raised an icon of Christ and swore before his men that he would return only in victory. Those gathered around him, veterans, peasants, monks turned soldiers, answered not with cheers, but with a quiet murmur of assent. The target was Armenia, where Persian rule rested on thin garrisons and resentful nobles. Heraclius's plan defied all logic, to abandon the defensive line of Anatolia and strike deep into enemy territory, forcing Khosrow to fight far from his supply routes. The emperor carried no siege engines, no heavy baggage. His army moved like a shadow across the mountains, fed by local supporters and the spoils of small victories. At Essus, near the Gulf, where Alexander had once broken Darius, the Romans won their first real battle in years. Heraclius led from the front, his horse plunging through Persian cavalry as horns blared across the valley. When the smoke cleared, Shahin's corps was shattered, its standards trampled in the mud. The victory was modest in scale, but enormous in meaning. The empire that had forgotten triumph remembered its own pulse. From Issus, the emperor pushed eastward through Cappadocia and into the Armenian highlands. The road was misery, rain, snow, and ambushes from hill tribes. But Heraclius refused to turn back. Each march carried a sermon. The empire must atone for its sins through endurance. Soldiers began to call him the Pilgrim King. At night, he walked among the tents barefoot, listening to the wounded and reciting psalms. The army followed him not out of fear, but belief. Khosrow, learning of the invasion, laughed at first. "The Roman dog barks again," he told his court. Yet the laughter faded when reports arrived of fortresses lost and roads cut. The empire that had seemed infinite was now stretched thin. Garrisons in Syria unpaid, supply caravans from Egypt delayed by rebellion, governors hoarding taxes. Shahrbaraz was ordered north, Shahin west. Both complained that their men were exhausted. The machine of conquest began to falter. Heraclius moved with the patience of a hunter. He struck, withdrew, then struck again. Persian scouts reported phantom armies. Villages surrendered to rumors before any soldiers arrived. The emperor's forces learned to fight like the enemy, swift, silent, and merciless. Skirmishes near the upper Euphrates turned into routs. The discipline of the Savaran cavalry, once Persia's pride, crumbled against ambushes that came from nowhere. In 623, Heraclius entered Atropatene, the heartland of Persia's fire temples. He advanced with a prayer on his lips and vengeance in his heart. Near Lake Urmia stood the sanctuary of Takhte Suleiman, the greatest Zoroastrian shrine in the realm. Its eternal flame had burned for centuries, tended by generations of magi. The emperor's troops stormed the complex, scattering the priests. When the sanctuary fell, Heraclius ordered the sacred fire extinguished and the temple burned. The act was both revenge and warning. The soldiers watched the smoke coil upward and whispered that heaven had judged the house of Sasan. The destruction of Takhte Suleiman carried more than symbolic weight. It struck at the empire's spiritual core, undermining the divine authority that justified Khosrow's rule. In Ctesiphon, panic rippled through the court. The king's letters to his generals turned venomous. Shahin was accused of negligence, Shahrbaraz of cowardice. Neither could answer. The couriers who carried their defense were intercepted or executed. Khosrow's faith in men had withered into suspicion. Heraclius, meanwhile, pressed deeper into enemy territory, sustained by alliances beyond the Caucasus. The Khazars, nomads of the northern steppes, answered his call, sending 40,000 horsemen to raid the Persian flank. Their arrival transformed the campaign. Mounted archers moved ahead of the Roman columns, sowing confusion wherever they appeared. Khosrow's armies now fought not one enemy, but a storm of them. By the end of 624, Heraclius had carved a scar across Persia, from Armenia to Media. His soldiers carried home wagons of loot, prisoners, and hope. For the first time in years, Constantinople's harbours filled with celebration. When word reached the capital, church bells rang until the metal cracked. The patriarch ordered every household to light a candle for the emperor's deliverance. The city that had once prayed for survival now prayed for victory. Yet Heraclius remained unsatisfied. Each success revealed how far the road still stretched. He knew that Khosrow would never yield while he drew breath. The empire might recover its land, even its relics, but peace required something greater, the shattering of Persian pride itself. In the winter camps along the Araxes River, the emperor looked east toward the mountains where his next campaign would lead. Snow covered the tents. The wind smelled of smoke and iron. His officers urged rest, but Heraclius shook his head. "We have not come to breathe," he said. "We have come to burn." The soldiers bowed their heads, understanding that this was no longer a war for land or treasure. It was a struggle for memory, whether history would end with the fire of Ahura Mazda or the cross of Christ. For now, the balance tilted toward Rome. The tide that had drowned an empire was beginning, at last, to recede. Snow still smouldered on the blackened stones of Takhte Suleiman when the army turned north. Behind them lay the extinguished altar of a faith. Ahead, passes that knifed through the Caucasus toward the royal roads of Media. What Heraclius had begun as a raid had become a reckoning. Temples lay gutted, granaries burst open, way stations stripped of horses. The king who called himself God's equal now felt the breath of an enemy in the corridors of his own house. Across the plain of Atropatene, fires flared each night like a second constellation. Roman foragers did not plunder at random. They burned canal gates and storehouses, hewed down bridge timbers, and drove off remount herds. Everything that made a campaign possible in spring. Khazar riders, the emperor's new companions, spread farther still, a blur of hooves and whistles, snatching couriers, scattering small garrisons, and then vanishing into fog. Messages that did reach the capital arrived late and nervous, each sealed tablet darker than the last. Ctesiphon answered with steel. Shahin, the careful architect of earlier victories, was ordered west with veterans scraped from every province. Shabaraz, the leopard of the south, was recalled from Syria with grudging speed. One brought method, the other audacity. Both carried the weight of a monarch who now doubted every oath. Their instructions were blunt: pin the Roman host against the mountains, crush it between hammer and shield, and send the emperor's head to the White Palace. Heraclius refused to be fixed. Columns slipped in and out of the Aras Valley, like shadows, building false camps by day, marching by night, leaving fires burning behind them as bait. When Persian scouts found a deserted encampment, they also found pits for horses, tripwires for night raids, and the sickening smell of spiked wine. A campaign that had once been arithmetic turned into rumor and chase. Near Ganzak, the dance finally tightened into battle. Shahin drew up a broad front on frost-stiff ground, heavy infantry in the center, cuirassed horse archers layered on the wings, the elite Savarans squared in reserve. His plan was old and sound: pin with arrows and weight, enclose with the cavalry squares, finish with cataphract shock. Heraclius met it with a line that looked fragile until it moved. The Roman fulcon, dense, shield-locked, javelins gripped overhand, absorbed the first arrow storm and crept forward in short, murderous steps. At the moment of contact, trumpets cut the air. A shell and wedge punched through the center. Flanks bent, not broke. Khazar horse erupted from a fold in the ground where no army should have hidden, pelting the Savaran with darts at the joints of their armor. For an hour the field hung in balance. Then discipline failed on the left, where a Persian squadron wheeled to cover a gap and drifted too far from its square. Heraclius threw in his household guard at a run. The breach became a wound, the wound a rout. Shahin's standard disappeared in the churn of men. By dusk, his line had unraveled into islands cut off by riders who hunted without mercy. When the moon climbed, the battlefield belonged to the living and to the wolves. Defeat broke the strategist as surely as any spear. He fell ill on the road south. Despair, fever, or poison, no chronicle can say, and died under a felt tent, attended only by a scribe who could no longer keep ink unfrozen. Word of his end reached the court like a dropped veil. Khosrow ordered public mourning for the general he had just accused of cowardice, then sent out fresh edicts that blamed treachery, fate, and insufficient sacrifice, never himself. Letters crossed the front like knives wrapped in silk. From the White Palace came a parchment spattered with cinnabar. To the slave who calls himself emperor, your God was not there when we took Jerusalem. He will not be there when we take your city. The answer rode back, folded around an iron nail. From the ruler whom your injustice raised. I found your temples full of fire. I left them full of smoke. Come and see if your gods can breathe ash. Courtiers read both by lamplight and shivered, for such words did not end in parley. Winter of 624 to 625 pressed down hard. Supply became the true battlefield. Roman detachments moved like wolves along caravan routes, seizing mules before grain, mules before arrows, anything that kept a man in the saddle. Whole districts were left unusable for a season, Canals choked with stone, cisterns salted, ferry chains hacked through and sunk. When Shahrbaraz pushed north at last, he found the stations that should have fed him replaced by black heaps and cawing birds. What followed was not one battle, but a campaign of feints and lunges that savaged both sides. In the passes east of Nakhchivan, cataphracts tried to grind up narrow defiles and left horses dead 3 deep. On the Araxes crossings, Roman bridge guards died to a man holding ropes against current and arrow. Each sunrise revealed new tricks. Decoy standards glimpsed at a distance. A line of camp kettles hung to sound like armor. Snow tamped into ramps for sudden night descents. Heraclius conserved his core and bled his enemy's margins. Shahrbaraz, from habit and pride, sought the one strike that would end the chase. He nearly found it, near the ruined fire temple at Shiz. The leopard set a lure with the ruthlessness that made his name. A small column drew the Romans across a wide marsh in pre-dawn mist. The ground turned to soup under iron feet. Hidden squadrons surged from both sides. For a handful of heartbeats, the imperial standard dipped and the line wavered. Then the pilgrim king rode straight into the pocket, dismounted in the sucking mud, and slammed his shield against the front rank like a workman at a gate. Officers copied him without thinking. The falcon locked. Javelins flew low enough to cut reeds. A path opened in the trap where Will had planted it, and the army staggered through. What Shahrbaraz gained was a legend of near death. What he lost was the conviction that the man he hunted could be broken by fear. Behind these maneuvers, a larger ruin spread that no dispatch could hide. Provinces once rich in wheat and wine sent sour taxes. Coin left the mints pale and light. Men deserted to guard their own farms. In the capital, petitioners lined the marble stairs with empty hands. Khosrow prowled the night galleries, listening to his empire creak. The court learned new silences. How to say yes without being noticed. How not to breathe when the king asked who had failed him now. Spring returned the armies to the upper Euphrates. There, on stubbled ground near the road to Theodosiopolis, both sides lunged again. The Roman plan was a braid. Khazar skirmishers to snag the flanks, infantry to draw the center into killing distance. Mailed horse held back for the cut. The Sasanian answer was pure geometry. Squares nested inside squares. Archers stepping through gaps to spit the advance. Kettle drums beating the pace of the charge. Noon turned to a haze of dust and chaff. By evening, neither army could claim the field. It was enough that the emperor walked from the smoke with his core intact, and his enemies convinced that this game would not end in the Caucasus. Amid stalemate, words sharpened again. Shahrbaraz received an order bearing the royal seal and the briefest command. Finish him. The general folded the tablet without reply. He had learned that victory, not obedience, would spare him. Heraclius, for his part, began sending letters not to the great king, but to the men who fed him, satraps, city elders, priests whose altars had gone out. Each carried a different lure: mercy, trade, restitution, the promise of winter without forced levy. A few answered. More merely hesitated. Hesitation was its own surrender. A day lost to doubt could not be regained by courage. Even triumphs left ash on the tongue. The destruction of temples had avenged Jerusalem, but the emperor would not allow the war to harden into a crusade of arson. In villages that opened their gates, he posted guards at fire altars and churches alike, forbidding looting on pain of the rope. What he wanted was not rubble, but withdrawal. A foe too hungry to hold Syria, too afraid to sleep near the passes, too unsure to march without glancing backward. By midsummer, that purpose showed in small ways. convoys that turned around at rumor, governors who wrote twice before sending grain west. The year 625 closed with an exchange both men remembered. A Persian courier caught near the Araz carried a tablet that mocked the emperor's god and promised that Constantinople would soon watch its women led away in chains. Heraclius read it by a watchfire, then dictated a reply. "You threaten what I have already sworn to defend to the death. I am where I ought to be. You are where your pride has led you. If your boats could cross the sea as easily as your tongue crosses the truth, you would not need to write at all." The messenger was given safe conduct to the frontier. Words could wound. Sometimes they were meant to be carried home. Strategy altered in the palace at last. Pride, stung by losses near the royal heartland, demanded a blow that would end patience. Agents rode west to the steppe beyond the Danube. Gold found Avar chiefs who understood only weight. Slavic war bands were promised plunder on the Bosporus. The design was elegant in its malice. A vice to crush the new Rome. Barbarian from landward walls, Persian from the Asian shore, while the emperor, deep in the east, learned he had saved nothing by marching. Heraclius learned in time. He did not rush home. Instead, he moved south and east, deeper into mountains where only oath and hunger kept men aligned, forcing his adversaries to choose between saving a capital far away or saving the villages beneath their feet. Orders flew from Ctesiphon, as from a man scooping water with both hands. Shahrbaraz was told to swing into Anatolia, to reach Chalcedon, to wait for horns from the European side. He obeyed, because obedience would keep his head a little longer. So the Great War bent toward its hinge. Along the Araxes, abandoned campfires glowed in orderly circles like coins spilled on dark cloth. Far off, in the marshes around the straits, Avar scouts counted towers and measured shadow. One ruler trusted walls and water. The other trusted movement and an oath. Between them ran the cold line of a sea that had ruined more invaders than any army ever fielded. The storm that would decide the age was gathering. Its first thunderheads rose over the Bosporus. At midsummer, the rumor became shape. From the hills beyond the Danube came the tramp of Avar tribes, their chieftain crowned in wolf skins and iron, banners of horsehair trailing in the wind. South of the Bosporus, Shahrbaraz's army advanced along the Asian shore, siege engines clattering like drums of fate. Between the two lay a single ribbon of water and the last breath of the Roman Empire. The plan had been conceived in Khosrow's hall months earlier. If the Romans could not be crushed in the field, they would be starved and strangled behind their own walls. The Avars would strike from Europe, the Persians from Asia. Once the two joined across the strait, Constantinople would fall like a jar between millstones. The King of Kings wrote to his general in polished fury, "Let the waters carry my vengeance. Let their towers become the steps of your throne." By July, the vice had begun to close. On the European side, the Avar host encamped along the Golden Horn, their tents a forest of poles and leather. Slavic auxiliaries cut timber for rams. Gothic mercenaries dragged catapults from the forests. Across the narrow strait, Shahrbaraz built floating bridges of reed rafts and tethered barges, hoping to ferry 12,000 men across to the Avar lines. From the walls, citizens could see both camps, the smoke of the barbarians to the west, the ordered gleam of Persian armor to the east. For the first time in centuries, the city of Constantine felt itself surrounded. Heraclius was far away, deep in the Caucasus with his army. He knew the trap had been meant for him as much as for the city. His absence was supposed to break its spirit. Instead, he sent words of defiance written in his own blood. The city of God needs no emperor, while faith holds the sea. The message arrived carried by a single rider, who crossed through enemy lines disguised as a pilgrim. Within the walls, Patriarch Sergius read it aloud from the steps of the Hagia Sophia. The people answered with a roar that drowned the tolling of bells. Defense became liturgy. Each morning, processions wound along the ramparts, priests bearing icons and censers, soldiers bowing their heads to receive blessings before taking their posts. Children carried candles made from the wax of melted saints' lamps. Women hauled stones to the battlements. The sea walls bristled with engines hastily repaired from old stockpiles, ballistae creaking like ancient beasts awakened from slumber. When the Avars began their assault, the earth itself seemed to groan. Siege towers taller than the walls rolled forward, shielded with hides soaked in vinegar. From the Asian shore, Shah Baraz's catapults hurled flaming barrels of pitch that arched like comets over the Bosporus. Yet each night, the attacks ended the same way. Fire drowning in water, ladders torn away, battering rams mired in mud. The defenders fought not only with courage, but with mathematics. The Byzantine engineers calculated angles and tides with the precision of monks illuminating scripture. The Persians' fatal flaw was the sea. Khosrow's empire had conquered mountains and deserts, but had never mastered salt water. The narrow channel that shimmered between the two armies became the city's guardian angel. Byzantine galleys patrolled it day and night, their oars beating a rhythm of survival. When Shah Baraz attempted the crossing, the current turned traitor. Storms rose from nowhere, tearing the raft bridges apart. Flames from Greek fire vessels swept through the debris, leaving a smear of burning oil that lit the strait like a wound. Of the 12,000 men who tried to cross, barely half reached shore, and none reached back. The Avars attacked again and again. On August nights, the walls shook with their chants. Trumpets of bone blared from the darkness. Stones from their engines crushed towers. Arrows fell like locusts. Inside the city, defenders sang hymns between volleys. The refrain, Theotokos, save thy people, echoing through smoke and blood. On the 10th day, Slavic barges tried to slip into the Golden Horn under fog. Byzantine fireships found them by sound alone, and dawn revealed the water carpeted with wreckage and the dead. Throughout it all, Sergius walked the ramparts carrying the icon of the Virgin, robes stained with ash. Chroniclers wrote that arrows hissed around him, but none found their mark. The soldiers swore that wherever the image passed, the line held. It was faith as armor, belief as geometry. Beyond the walls, frustration poisoned the alliance. Avar chieftains accused the Persians of cowardice. Shah Baraz, enraged by their failures, refused further cooperation. Messengers galloped between the camps, carrying insults instead of orders. Khosrow's design, perfect on parchment, dissolved in mistrust. The great king waited in Ctesiphon for word of victory, and instead received silence. Inside Constantinople, starvation loomed but never conquered. The city lived on salted fish, on barley scraped from temple stores, on prayer. Yet hope had become contagious. Each failed assault was read as proof of divine favor. Sailors sang as they rode through the smoke. Children chased sparks from burning arrows and laughed. A city that should have died began to feel immortal. By the last week of August, the siege had spent itself. The Avar host withdrew first, dragging its engines into the forests. Slavic tribes melted away toward the Danube. Shah Baraz lingered for a day longer, watching the sunlight flash on the city's domes from across the strait. He had come within sight of conquest, yet could not touch it. Then, under cover of darkness, his campfires vanished. The dawn that followed was the quietest Constantinople had ever known. The defenders stood on the ramparts and stared at the empty horizon, unable to believe that the miracle had held. When Patriarch Sergius led the victory procession through the streets, he carried the Virgin's icon high above his head. Bells pealed from every church. Even the sea seemed to applaud, its surface glittering with the ashes of burned ships. Far away in the mountains, Heraclius received the news with tears that no soldier saw. The empire had survived without him. The walls he had trusted more than his own body had kept their oath. But he also knew what the victory meant for his enemy. The invincible empire of Khosrow had struck at the heart of Rome and failed. The God King had sent his finest general and his mightiest allies, and heaven itself had turned them back. The balance of the world had shifted. On the shores of the Bosporus, faith had defeated fire. In the silence after the siege, Heraclius began to plan the journey that would finish what he had begun, to carry the war into the king's own house and end, once and for all, the ancient rivalry of East and West. Winter came late to Mesopotamia that year, bringing not snow, but a biting wind that rasped against the walls of every fortress still bearing the lion standard of Persia. Across the plains, garrisons stood half empty, their soldiers unpaid and sick. For the first time in his reign, Khosrow II no longer sent orders to the front, only demands for miracles. He had dismissed the bad omens, ignored the priests, and silenced the few generals still brave enough to tell him that his empire was bleeding from within. The storm he had unleashed a generation earlier was returning home. Heraclius, having turned back the siege of Constantinople, no longer fought for survival. He fought for balance. By 627 AD, he had spent nearly a decade reshaping defeat into endurance. His armies were lean, the old bureaucracies replaced by faith and motion. The Khazar alliance had dissolved with the snows, but a remnant of their horsemen remained as scouts. To them, the emperor promised spoils measured not in coin, but in legend, the ruin of the greatest king alive. The campaign that would end the war began in late autumn. Against every rule of military sense, Heraclius chose to strike in winter, when roads froze solid and the rivers themselves could serve as highways. Persian armies expected him to wait for spring. He would arrive with the frost, gathering perhaps 40,000 men, Romans, Armenians, Georgians, and steppe riders. He marched through Armenia's passes and descended upon the Tigris basin. The journey was a testament to both madness and design. Frost bit through iron, horses slipped on glassy slopes, yet the emperor pressed forward, carrying a relic of the true cross as standard. By the time they reached the plain near Nineveh, Persian scouts had finally understood his purpose. Khosrow, taken by surprise, scraped together an army of nearly equal size under the general Rhazates, a man famed for courage but not command. The two forces met on the 12th of December. The plain was half frozen, the morning light dim and metallic. Heraclius positioned his troops in 3 divisions, infantry in the center with light cavalry veiled behind, flanking detachments held back in reserve. Rhazates deployed in traditional Sasanian style, cataphracts at the heart, archers spread along the wings, elephants kept in the rear to intimidate rather than charge. The king himself watched from afar, confident that winter and numbers would serve his cause. The battle opened with arrows. Persian archers advanced and loosed in thick waves, shafts clattering off the Roman shields. Heraclius ordered his men to hold, then feigned retreat. The enemy, believing the ruse, surged forward to finish the rout. At his signal, the center wheeled, forming a crescent that enveloped the charging cavalry. Khazar riders burst from concealment on the left, slicing into the Persian flank. Within moments, discipline faltered. Rhazates, seeing his line buckle, rode forward to challenge the emperor himself, a gesture as old as war. Heraclius accepted. In the middle of the field, the two commanders met between the corpses of their men. Chroniclers describe the moment in terse wonder. The Roman, cloaked in red, his sword rimed with frost. The Persian, mailed in silver, his spear like a sunbeam in the haze. They circled once. Then Heraclius struck low, unhorsing his opponent and ending the duel with a single blow. The sight shattered the last coherence of the Persian ranks. By dusk, the field of Nineveh was littered with 28,000 Persian dead. The survivors fled toward the east, carrying tales that the Roman emperor fought like a creature of flame. Heraclius ordered the bodies buried where they lay, muttering a prayer for both armies. War, he said, had become the same god served by all. The road to the capital lay open. Heraclius advanced carefully, bypassing the ruins of cities that had once sent tribute to Khosrow. Villages offered food and guides. Governors deserted their posts. The empire that had terrified the world was dissolving faster than it could be conquered. When the army reached Yazdegerd, Khosrow's favorite palace, they found it abandoned but intact, its storerooms bursting with treasures looted from half the known world. There were silks from China, golden mosaics stripped from Antioch, statues of Greek gods taken from temples 2 centuries dead. The emperor entered the throne room alone. Above him hung the peacock canopy of the Sasanian kings, its gems dimmed by dust. On the dais lay the royal diadem, too heavy for one man's neck. Heraclius touched it and turned away. He allowed his soldiers to plunder the palace, but forbade the burning of it. "Let the wind do that work," he said. By nightfall, flames licked through the courtyards, and the city's roofs collapsed under their own splendor. Khosrow fled east to Ctesiphon, abandoning his harem, his archives, and what remained of his reason. He accused the gods of betrayal, his ministers of treachery, his sons of conspiracy. The court, long trained in flattery, now trembled in silence. One by one, his nobles vanished from the palace, slipping into the night to join the rebellion, gathering beyond the city walls. Heraclius halted his advance at the outskirts of the capital. The Tigris lay swollen with winter melt, too wide to cross quickly, and he had no wish to fight street by street. Instead, he sent a letter written in his own hand. "I came not for your crown, but for peace. Return what you have taken, and the world may yet survive." The messenger never reached the king. Khosrow's guards tore him apart for bringing bad news. The end came not from battle, but from within. 17 nobles, led by Khosrow's son Kavad, conspired to end the madness that had turned Persia into a pyre. They entered the palace through the servants' tunnels and found the king of kings crouched beside a cold brazier, muttering to himself. The man who had once been lord of half the earth was dragged from his chamber, stripped of his crown, and imprisoned in a stone cellar beneath the treasury. There he died within days, some say by arrow, others by starvation. The chronicles agree only on one detail. When they found the body, the eyes were open, fixed toward the west. In the chaos that followed, Kavad II took the throne. His first act was to sue for peace. Envoys rode to Heraclius bearing letters of contrition and the promise of restoration. The Roman emperor, weary from years of dust and blood, accepted. He demanded the return of all captured territories, and above all, the relic of the true cross. In the spring of 628, the treaty was sealed. Persian courtiers wept with relief. Roman soldiers knelt in thanksgiving. The two empires that had ground each other to dust agreed to stand still at last. Heraclius entered the holy city, carrying the recovered relic on his shoulders, barefoot as penance. The crowds wept and sang. Bells rang from every church. Incense rose like dawn. Still, beneath the celebration, lay exhaustion so deep it could not be cured by peace. Persia's nobility was divided, its treasury ruined, its armies ghosts of their former glory. The Byzantines were scarcely better, cities in ashes, fields untended, an empire held together by faith and famine. When the torches burned low that night in Jerusalem, Heraclius looked east and saw only shadows. He had restored the world, but the world was dying. The peace that followed was not triumph, but collapse in slow motion. For a quarter century, the world had burned from the Nile to the Oxus. Now the ashes drifted into the palaces of both victors. The Treaty of 628 ended the war, yet neither empire possessed the strength to live within it. Soldiers returned to villages that no longer existed, priests to temples where the fires had gone out, and kings to thrones that ruled only ruins. In Persia, the palace at Ctesiphon smelled of smoke and vinegar. Kavad II, newly crowned after his father's murder, received Heraclius's envoys with trembling hands. He was a youth of delicate health, terrified of the throne he had inherited and haunted by his father's fate. His first act was mercy. He freed prisoners, recalled exiles, and promised an age of renewal. His second act destroyed him. To secure his reign, he ordered the execution of his brothers and half-brothers, 17 princes in all. The massacre purged the royal bloodline and poisoned the realm. The empire that had once seemed eternal now became a revolving door of monarchs. When plague swept through Mesopotamia in the summer of 628, Kavad himself died within months of his coronation. The pestilence carried off tens of thousands, soldiers and farmers alike, spreading from the Tigris to the mountains of Media. Corpses lay unburied in the streets of Seleucia. Even the sacred fires of the Magi went unattended. Grain rotted in storage as villages sealed themselves in despair. After Kavad's death, the throne passed from hand to hand like a cursed relic. Ardashir III, a child no older than 9, was crowned next, his diadem slipping down over frightened eyes. For a year, his regent tried to govern, while generals squabbled and governors withheld taxes. Then came Shahrbaraz, the conqueror of Egypt, returning at last to claim his reward. His army, more loyal to him than to any crown, marched on the capital and seized it without a fight. The usurper reigned for 40 days. A dagger ended his rule before he could even sign his first edict. Boran, daughter of Khosrow II, succeeded him, a woman of intelligence and weary grace. She restored coinage, reopened temples, and issued proclamations calling for justice. For a moment, it seemed the empire might breathe again, but the wound ran too deep. Court factions divided around her. One month's allies became the next month's executioners. Boran was strangled in her sleep. Her sister Azarmigdux followed, ruling briefly before she too fell to intrigue and steel. By 632, the house of Sasan had consumed itself. The last heir, Yazdegerd III, barely 16, was crowned in a city echoing with ghosts. The nobles kissed his hand and whispered that the gods had preserved the dynasty. They knew better. Their oaths were habit, not faith. Each province now governed as it pleased, collecting taxes it no longer sent, raising militias that owed loyalty to coin rather than crown. In Byzantium, the emperor who had outlasted Khosrow faced his own hollow victory. Heraclius returned to Constantinople, bearing the relic of the true cross, its restoration celebrated as proof that divine order had returned. The people lined the streets, weeping as he carried it through the gates barefoot. Bells rang, hymns poured from every church. For a brief hour, the empire remembered itself. But beneath the incense drifted the same fatigue that poisoned Persia. The population had been gutted by famine and conscription, the treasury drained to nothing, paid soldiers with promises. In the provinces, fields lay fallow, aqueducts collapsed, and plague followed the same road it had taken eastward. Heraclius, once the firebrand of faith, began to fade. Gout crippled him. Whispers of divine disfavor returned. The church, triumphant in ceremony, argued over doctrine while the army muttered about arrears. Both empires had won nothing they could keep. The peace of 628 had restored the borders, but broken the men who guarded them. The armies that had once hurled spears across continents now clutched their pay ledgers instead of weapons. Generals turned farmers. Farmers turned beggars. Along the Euphrates, forts that had seen centuries of war stood silent. A traveler could cross from one frontier to another without meeting a single patrol. Even the coin told the story. In Persia, drachms bore the image of monarchs who had reigned for mere weeks. In Byzantium, Heraclius's face appeared gaunt, almost skeletal, surrounded by inscriptions of victory that mock their owner. Merchants accepted both currencies with reluctance, weighing them for silver that was no longer there. Religious fervor, once the lifeblood of war, curdled into superstition. The Zoroastrian priests quarreled over ritual purity. The Christian bishops argued over Christ's nature. Each side proclaimed that its suffering was divine punishment for the other's arrogance. The faithful burned incense for peace and ended their prayers by cursing their neighbors. In the autumn of 630, Heraclius stood again in Jerusalem to return the true cross to the Holy Sepulchre. The ceremony was magnificent, yet the emperor's eyes were distant. He had climbed from ruin to glory, and discovered that glory was merely another form of ruin. "I have carried the world," he murmured to a monk who accompanied him, "and it was made of smoke." That same year, caravans from Arabia reached both courts, carrying rumors of a new faith spreading from the desert. Few paid attention. Persia's nobles were too busy choosing sides in their latest coup. Byzantium's officials dismissed the tales as nomad gossip. No one imagined that the next wind rising from those sands would reshape the world more swiftly than all the wars before it. The years between 628 and 632 passed like the slow collapse of a great monument. Each stone fell quietly. Each crack widened without sound. The earth itself seemed exhausted by empire. Farmers planted, knowing they would not harvest. Soldiers drilled, knowing they would not fight. Across the ancient frontier, the ruins of fortresses faced one another over empty fields, their towers leaning like old men sharing secrets. In the spring of 632, when Yazdegerd ascended the Persian throne and Heraclius lay ill in his palace, the two ancient empires stood again in fragile symmetry, neither victorious, neither whole. Between them stretched a wasteland of burned cities, nameless graves, and forgotten oaths. Out of that stillness, something unseen began to move. The chroniclers of both realms would later agree on one truth. The Great War had ended, but history had not. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the pause before another voice began to speak, a voice born not in palace or temple, but in the desert beyond their maps. From the south came a wind unburdened by banners, trailing only dust and rumor. In the year 632 AD, when Yazdegerd III was crowned in Ctesiphon and Heraclius still ailed in his palace by the Bosporus, few in either court noticed the murmur from the desert. A new creed was taking shape among the tribes of Arabia, uniting them under one God and one command: to spread the faith beyond the sands that had confined them. The empires that once divided the world were too weary to listen. At Medina, a city born of trade and revelation, the first caliph, Abu Bakr, gathered the clans who had followed the Prophet Muhammad. Their unity was recent, fragile, and fiery. For the first time in memory, Bedouin horsemen who had raided each other for water and camels now rode under a single cause. What they lacked in armor, they replaced with discipline and belief. They carried little baggage, trusted the desert as their ally, and fought with the clarity of those who had nothing to lose. To the north, Persia lay unguarded. The long war had devoured its army, its officers, and its will. Garrisons that once stood watch over the frontier now farmed or extorted the villages around them. Silver coins had turned pale. Soldiers accepted payment in grain. Provincial governors, ruling as petty kings, cared more for their own estates than for the crown. Yazdegerd, barely 16, inherited the echo of a throne. His courtiers bowed deeply, but their loyalty was measured in days. The first raids came like whispers. In 633, small bands of Arab cavalry crossed the Euphrates and struck at the outposts of Hera, seizing livestock and returning to the desert before any pursuit could form. When Yazdegerd's generals finally reacted, they found not armies to fight, but trails that vanished in the sand. To them, these attacks were an irritation, not a warning. They rebuilt burned villages and wrote reports, assuring the court that all was under control. Then came Khalid ibn al-Walid, called the Sword of God. His arrival turned a border skirmish into a conquest. Leading barely 10,000 men, he moved through the desert as if guided by the wind itself. His cavalry struck in silence, each charge timed to the pulse of the enemy's fear. Persian levies, untrained and half-fed, broke before the first collision. Within months, the great fortress city of Hira had surrendered. The fall of Hira shocked the Sasanian nobles, but the paralysis of empire had become habit. Yazdegerd ordered new levies from Media and Khorasan, yet few answered. Those who did were ill-equipped, their armor scavenged from forgotten arsenals. The royal treasury, once a mountain of silver, had shrunk to coins melted and restruck from temple ornaments. Still the king tried to appear unshaken. He ordered prayers to Ahura Mazda and promised divine vengeance. None came. By 634, the Arab armies had secured Mesopotamia's western plains. Their camps spread along the Euphrates, tents pitched where Persian banners had once stood. The caliph's generals organized their forces with astonishing simplicity, each tribe under its own leader, each leader bound by faith and personal oath. There were no supply trains. The desert fed them. To Yazdegerd's satraps, the new enemy seemed to multiply from the sand itself. The Byzantines, watching from Syria, understood the threat only after it was too late. Heraclius, still weakened by illness, sent envoys urging the Persians to join in defense of civilization. The messages arrived in Ctesiphon unread. Old hatred weighed more than reason. Two empires that had destroyed each other could not now learn alliance. In the spring of 635, the Arabs crossed the Tigris in force. Persian armies, scattered across the provinces, struggled to assemble. At the Battle of the River, near modern-day Baghdad, the two sides met. The Persians numbered perhaps 30,000, conscripts, farmers, remnants of the old Savaran cavalry. Their commander, Bahman Jaduya, arrayed them in traditional fashion, armored horsemen forming the core, foot archers on the flanks, elephants in front to terrify the enemy. The Arabs, fewer by half, formed in loose ranks, each warrior guided by voice and sight rather than trumpet. As the elephants advanced, archers aimed for their eyes. Blinded beasts trampled their own lines. When the cavalry charged, the desert riders flowed around them like water around stone, circling and striking from behind. The Persian center collapsed before sunset. Bahman escaped across the river, leaving his standards in the mud. The defeat marked more than a lost battle. It revealed that Persia no longer knew how to win. Heraclius, hearing of the disaster, sighed rather than rejoiced. Byzantium, too, was sick from victory. The emperor could not march, his legs swollen, his empire barely coherent. Yet he sensed the pattern returning. The rhythm of invasion, the rising of a new world from the ruins of the old. The fire that consumed them will find us next, he said, and no one contradicted him. The caliphate pressed on. Town after town surrendered without resistance, preferring the certainty of new rulers to the chaos of the old. Arab governors imposed modest taxes and left the local faiths untouched, an act of pragmatism mistaken for mercy. Persian peasants, long crushed by tribute and conscription, found in the conquerors a strange fairness. In marketplaces, they whispered that perhaps the one god favored the strangers now. Yazdegerd retreated eastward to Media, gathering what remained of his court. Messengers brought him reports of defeats so constant they blurred together. Hera fallen, Anbar gone, the roads to Ctesiphon open. In desperation, he sent envoys to Heraclius pleading for aid, promising gold, silk, and peace. The Byzantine emperor, too frail to act, replied only with prayer. By 636, the inevitable approached. Rustam Farrokhzad, last of the great Sasanian generals, assembled an army near al-Qadisiyyah on the Euphrates plain. His force numbered perhaps 60,000. The remnants of the empire's western levies, drawn up in banners that still bore the lion and sun. Across the field waited an Arab host less than half their number, veterans of Hira and the desert wars. Between them stretched a landscape of dust and reeds, crossed by canals that glimmered like glass. The two armies camped in sight of each other, their watchfires forming rival constellations. Rustam swore that he would drive the invaders back to the sands from which they came. Khalid had already moved south to fight the Byzantines, but his comrades under Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas took command, their confidence serene, their faith unbreakable. For 4 days they would fight, and by the end of it, the world would change. As Yazdegerd prayed in the sanctuary of Ctesiphon, he could not yet see the pattern that history was drawing around him. His ancestors had raised empires upon fire and discipline. He faced an enemy whose weapon was belief. The storm that swept north from Arabia would not stop at his borders, nor at Heraclius's fading empire. It would roll over the bones of both, leaving behind a new order, where gods, languages, and loyalties would be remade. The drums of al-Qadisiyyah began to beat. The earth, exhausted by centuries of empire, was about to bear another dawn. Al-Qadisiyyah spread across Mesopotamia's center, like a scar that never closed. To the east shimmered the canals of the Euphrates, lined with reeds. To the west lay the open desert, where wind carved dunes into shifting battlements. In the early autumn of 636 AD, two armies faced one another across that flat expanse, one ancient and armored in memory, the other new and lean, driven by faith. It was here that the fate of Persia would be decided. Rustam Farrokhzad, the last of the great Sasanian generals, commanded the host of the empire. His army was magnificent in form if hollow in spirit, 60,000 strong, armored in polished bronze and steel, banners painted with the lion and sun. He had assembled every remnant of power left to the house of Sasan, cataphracts from Media, elephant corps from Fars, archers from the hills of Elam. Along the front ranks stood the surviving veterans of Khosrow's wars, men who had fought Byzantines, Turks, and Arabs across half the known world. Behind them trailed camp followers and slaves, artisans, and perfumers. A mobile city meant to remind the soldiers that empire still lived. Across the field waited an army 1/3 that size, led by Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, a companion of the Prophet. His warriors bore no ornaments, only plain steel and leather. They carried water skins instead of wagons and recited verses in place of drums. Their lines were loose, their movement fluid. The Persians saw in them only rabble, but they would soon learn that discipline can live without hierarchy and courage without reward. The first day began beneath a sun that seemed intent on burning the world clean. Rustam opened with ceremony. He rode forward beneath the royal standard, the Drafsh-e-Kaviani, and called for a parley. Messengers crossed the no-man's land and were received by the Arab commanders in their tents. Rustam offered peace in exchange for tribute and obedience to the Persian throne. Sa'd's reply was quiet. "We seek neither gold nor land, but the truth of God. Accept it and live, reject it and fall." When the envoys returned, Rustam's captains laughed, but the general did not. Battle followed with the discipline of ritual. Trumpets blared, drums thundered. The Persian line advanced under a canopy of arrows. Elephants led the charge, their tusks sheathed in iron, scattering the Arab cavalry with each stride. By dusk, the plain belonged to Persia once more. The invaders retreated across the canals, leaving their dead unburied. Rustam believed the first day a victory, yet his veterans warned him that the Arabs were not routed, they were waiting. On the second morning, the wind rose. Sand swept across the field, erasing the tracks of the fallen. When the Persians advanced again, they found themselves fighting ghosts. The Arabs appeared and vanished in the dust, striking the flanks and rear before slipping away. Arrows fell in unpredictable rain. The elephants panicked, trampling their own lines. Rustam's commanders rallied the infantry with shouted oaths, but confusion spread faster than courage. The battle dissolved into skirmishes that raged until nightfall. The third day brought the storm. A gale from the desert blew directly into the Persian front, turning the air into a wall of dust. Visibility fell to nothing. Orders were lost in the roar of the wind. The Arabs, fighting with the sun and storm at their backs, moved by sound alone, the call of trumpets, the echo of chants. Allahu Akbar rolled across the plain like thunder. Horses screamed, banners vanished, formations melted. In that chaos, Rustam's army fought itself as much as its enemy. When the storm passed, both sides were spent. The Persians built ramparts of shields and wagons. The Arabs prayed where they stood. Night fell heavy and silent, except for the moans of the dying. Rustam sat beneath his standard, his armor grey with dust, his face carved with disbelief. He had commanded men all his life and understood the rhythm of war, but not this. His army fought bravely, yet something invisible gnawed at their hearts. For the first time, he felt the weight of centuries pressing against him, as though the very gods of Persia were growing tired. At dawn on the fourth day, Sa'd gave the order to attack. The Arab cavalry surged forward in waves, their momentum carrying them through the weakened Persian center. Rustam rode to rally his men, shouting until his voice broke. Amid the chaos, a single arrow struck the rope of the royal banner, sending it crashing to the ground. The fall of the Drafsh-e-Kaviani rippled through the ranks like a curse. Soldiers began to flee. Elephants turned and stampeded toward the river. Rustam fought on, refusing to yield. When a gust lifted his cloak, it tangled in the axle of a wagon. A fleeing horse overturned it, crushing the general beneath. By the time his attendants found him, the battle was already lost. His body was carried away by the current of the canal, armor gleaming briefly before sinking into the mud. The Persians broke completely. Some threw down their weapons and surrendered. Others fled toward Ctesiphon, pursued across the river by Arab horsemen. The plain that had begun the week alive with banners was now a sea of corpses. 30,000 Persians lay dead. Their camp, rich with silks and gold, fell to the victors. Saad forbade looting until the wounded were buried. He walked among the fallen in silence, reciting verses over enemy and ally alike. When word reached Ctesiphon, Yazdegerd wept not for Rustam, but for himself. The road to the capital was open. He ordered the royal treasury loaded onto barges and fled east toward Media. Behind him, the city emptied. The Arabs entered days later without resistance, finding the palaces abandoned and the river choked with discarded finery. The imperial treasury, the wealth of 4 centuries, became the caliphate's prize. The fall of Ctesiphon marked the death of an age. The Zoroastrian priests extinguished their temple fires before the conquerors could touch them. The artisans and scribes who had once filled the capital with music and law scattered into the provinces. Only silence remained where the drums of empire had once sounded. In Constantinople, Heraclius heard the news with the weariness of a man who had already buried too much. The same year that saw Persia's heart fall also brought his own decline. Gout and age confined him to his chambers. He is said to have murmured, "Another empire goes to its judgment." For the Persians, the judgment was swift. Their armies were gone, their king a fugitive, their gods in retreat. The lion and sun that had once shone from every banner now lay trampled in the mud of al-Qadisiyyah. In its place rose a symbol without lineage, a simple phrase uttered in every tongue that would soon echo across 3 continents. The desert had triumphed over the city, faith over tradition, and movement over empire. From that battlefield's dust, a new world began to breathe. The wind that swept across Mesopotamia after Al-Qadisiyyah carried the scent of endings. In its gusts drifted ashes from burned standards and the whisper of languages that would soon fade from memory. The empire of the House of Sasan, which had claimed descent from the kings of old Persia and the favor of the gods themselves, was finished in all but name. The lion and sun no longer ruled the horizon, only the crescent banners of the caliphate moving steadily east. When the news of Rustam's death reached Yazdegerd III, the young king fled again, eastward through the cities that had once shouted his ancestors' names. He rode beneath shuttered windows and streets stripped bare of soldiers. At each stop, the royal court shrank, nobles slipping away under cover of night, servants vanishing with their pay, governors promising reinforcements that never came. The crown jewels and sacred fire altars were loaded onto wagons, guarded more carefully than the king himself. Ctesiphon, the city of 1,000 archers, fell in 637 without a cry. The Arabs entered through gates the citizens themselves had opened. The palaces of Khosrow II were looted in order, each courtyard stripped before the next. The royal throne, a golden seat shaped like an eagle, was carried off piece by piece, its gemstones pried loose for the treasury of Medina. Persian scribes who survived recorded the fall with a stunned precision. The river choked with furniture, the archives scattered, the gardens trampled by camels drinking from marble fountains. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, commander of the caliph's forces, forbade wanton destruction. He ordered the soldiers to extinguish fires in the temples and to spare the poor. Even the surviving nobles found this restraint strange. They had expected barbarism and instead found order. To many, conquest felt less like collapse than substitution. The taxes were lighter, the laws simpler, the promises strangely believable. Yazdegerd fled north to Media, seeking allies among the mountain satraps who still called themselves Persians. Some received him with ceremony, offering bread and oaths. Others sent messengers to the Arabs, declaring submission before he had even left their halls. The king, barely 20, carried the burden of 4 centuries and the futility of 1. His empire had become geography. In 638, the caliph's armies pushed deeper into the Zagros passes. The battle at Jalula ended all pretense of recovery. The Persians fought with desperate valor, driving the enemy back into the ravines 3 times before the final breach. By sunset, 30,000 of Yazdegerd's soldiers lay dead among the reeds. The survivors fled eastward, the young king among them. His court chronicler, writing years later, called it the night the stars of Iran fell into the river. After Jalula came the final stroke. In 642, near the town of Nahavand, the last army of Persia gathered, 50,000 men drawn from the remnants of every province still loyal. Their leaders named the coming battle Victory of Victories. It was to be the moment when history reversed, when empire reclaimed its destiny. But history had already chosen its direction. The Persian host advanced down the valley, confident in numbers and terrain. The Arabs, outnumbered 2 to 1, pretended retreat, abandoning the field as if in panic. Rusty pride followed them. When the Persians pursued into the narrow defile, the desert warriors turned and struck. The ambush was complete. Arrows poured from the slopes. Horses reared in the crush. Dust swallowed commands. What began as battle became slaughter. By nightfall, the mountain gorge ran red. The flower of the old nobility, the Mihrans, the Surans, the sparbeds, lay dead among their retainers. News of Nahavand broke what little remained of resistance. Cities that had once defied Alexander now surrendered without siege. Fire temples dimmed one by one as their priests fled east. In Fars, the birthplace of the dynasty, villagers lowered the banners of the lion and raised the white flags of submission. The caliph's generals moved through the heartland like administrators rather than conquerors, establishing garrisons, recording taxes, offering protection in exchange for peace. The transition from empire to province was less explosion than exhale. Yazdegerd continued his flight, first to Isfahan, then to Rai, then farther still. His court, now reduced to a handful of loyalists, lived from borrowed grain and promises. The treasury wagons were gone, the crown pawned to foreign princes. Even his faith wavered. The sacred fires had gone out in every temple he passed, the priests dispersing to distant mountains. The boy king carried a small brazier in his carriage, lighting it each night himself, whispering prayers to a god who no longer answered. In the west, Heraclius was dying. The emperor who had once mirrored Khosrow's ambition lived long enough to see both empires undone by the same wind. From his sickbed in Constantinople, he heard of Nahavand and understood its meaning. That Rome's last rival was gone, and that his own line stood next before the storm. He muttered, "We fought too long, and for the wrong gods." By 642, The empire of the Sasanians existed only in titles and memory. Persian generals who had once worn gilded armor now served as mercenaries for their conquerors. Zoroastrian nobles converted to save their estates. Others vanished into the mountains of Dalam, swearing oaths to a lost world. The Persians called that year the Dark Sunrise, a dawn that illuminated everything except themselves. The war that had begun as vengeance between two kings had consumed two civilizations. 25 years earlier, Khosrow II had raised his sword to avenge Maurice of Byzantium. Now neither Rome nor Persia commanded the world they had fought over. From the deserts of Arabia came a new empire, one that spoke of justice and unity, but built its dominion on the bones of both. The chroniclers of the Caliphate wrote of Nahevand as destiny fulfilled, while Persian scribes described it as judgment delivered. Between their versions lies the same truth. Exhaustion is the seedbed of conquest. The fire that had lit Persia for 400 years guttered out not in defeat, but in silence. In the ruins of a temple near Ecbatana, an old magus tended a single ember beneath a cracked dome. When asked why he guarded a flame that could no longer save his world, he answered, "Because the sun has set before, and still it rises." The boy who had once worn the crown of Persia became a wanderer. After Nahevand, Yazdegerd III fled eastward, with no army left to command and no city left to defend. The empire that had stretched from the Indus to the Nile had shrunk to a single figure on horseback, followed by a few guards, a treasurer with an empty chest, and the last high priest of the fire. The age of the Sasanian kings was ending not in battle, but in exile. He rode first to Isfahan, where the governor received him with bow and oath, and sent a secret letter of surrender to the Arabs that same night. From there, he went to Ray, where the nobles demanded payment before promising allegiance. The royal seal, once a mark of divine authority, was now currency for survival. The king paid in promises he could never keep. Each day his caravan grew smaller. Each sunrise began another flight. In the west, the new rulers moved methodically. Caliph Umar's generals divided Persia into provinces, appointing local governors who collected tribute and left the people's faith untouched. The garrisons were small but disciplined, each post commanded by men who had risen from poverty to power by faith alone. The conquerors called themselves servants, not kings. Their restraint was more terrifying than cruelty. Temples remained standing, their fires extinguished, but their altars unbroken. The Persians, weary of tyranny, found in submission a strange kind of peace. By 645, Yazdegerd had retreated beyond the old royal roads into the rugged lands of Khorasan, where Persian rule had begun 4 centuries earlier. His proclamations still bore the royal title, King of Kings, Shadow of God, but his authority ended at the edge of his campfires. From Merv, he sent letters to China, to the Turks, to any court that might still remember the grandeur of his ancestors. The Tang emperor answered with courtesy, but no army. A handful of Chinese envoys would later write that the Persian monarch spoke proudly, yet looked always toward the west, as if searching for a home. While the king sought allies, the Arab advance continued like a tide that never receded. Each year new provinces surrendered, their governors swearing loyalty to the caliph in exchange for their lives. Resistance became banditry, rebellion an act of suicide. Persian nobles who once competed for the throne now competed for appointments under their conquerors. In the bazaars, merchants struck new coins bearing Arabic script beside the faded image of the old crown, a strange alloy of worlds in transition. Yazdegerd's own court became a ghostly parody of empire. His attendants spoke to him in whispers, afraid to mention the losses that came each week. When he slept, he dreamed of fire, temples blazing not with faith, but with the flames of conquest. The high priest who still traveled with him tended a single brazier of sacred light, its coals carried in an iron chest from camp to camp. Each dawn, the king knelt before it, feeding it splinters of cedar and murmuring the ancient prayers of Ahura Mazda. The flame flickered lower each day, starved of oil. In 648, he found brief refuge in the city of Balkh, where remnants of his people gathered around him. They called him the Restorer, the Phoenix of the Faith. But even there the shadow lengthened. The governor, tempted by promises from the Arabs, plotted to betray him. Yazdegerd escaped once more, slipping into the desert under a veil of sandstorm. Those who rode with him now numbered fewer than 20. By 651, the journey ended. The last king of kings reached Merv, seeking asylum with a local miller, whose loyalty he could not buy. The man, fearing pursuit and coveting the small purse of coins the king still carried, struck him down with a stone. Thus perished the son of Khosrow, heir to Darius and Cyrus, murdered not in battle but by poverty. His body was buried hastily near the river. By dawn, the grave had already filled with wind-blown sand. When word of his death reached the Arab commanders, they ordered that the tomb remain undisturbed. "God alone judges kings," one of them said. The conquerors moved on, their columns vanishing into the east. Behind them, the last embers of the old world cooled into history. In the months that followed, Persia changed not by decree, but by rhythm. Fire temples became mosques, their domes repainted rather than destroyed. The old prayers survived in secret, whispered beside hearths rather than altars. Zoroastrian priests fled to the mountains of Yazd and the islands of Hormuz, carrying their sacred texts across generations. The children of their children would still tend flames, calling them the light of truth, refusing to let them die. In Constantinople, Heraclius did not live to see the final act. He died in the same year as Yazdegerd, his empire still standing, but already bleeding. The two ancient rulers, one Christian, one Zoroastrian, passed from the world within months of each other, leaving the field to new believers who called themselves the heirs of both revelation and sword. The chroniclers who later tried to describe those years disagreed on every detail except one, that an age had ended. For 1,000 years, the world had been shaped by the rivalry of East and West, of Rome and Persia, of cross and fire. When both were gone, the maps themselves began to change. Caravans carried new languages. Merchants weighed silver stamped with verses instead of crowns. From the ruins of two exhausted empires rose a faith that promised unity where once there had been division. Centuries later, pilgrims would pass through the ruins of Ctesiphon and find the great arch still standing, its shadow vast and hollow. They would say that when the wind passed through its curve, it sounded like a voice murmuring in an unknown tongue. Perhaps it was the echo of a fallen empire, or perhaps the sigh of the world itself, remembering what had been lost. The House of Sasan had ruled for 400 years. Its fall was not the collapse of a dynasty, but the end of an epoch, the closing of the last chapter of the ancient world. The fire of Persia did not die. It changed shape, hidden within new flames, waiting to be reborn. And somewhere beneath the desert, the dust of kings still stirred with the wind, whispering of a world that had burned bright before the dawn of another.